Yeah, so we've got a big task on our hands, and after the last meeting, I felt maybe it was time to take stock of where we are in this process that we're in, and also have a think about um, what some of the implications are of some of the decisions that we're having to make, and how we're feeling about it, and why we might be feeling that way. Because when you go through any major change in life, whether it's whether it's moving house, or a change of job, or getting divorced, or a new, a merger of parishes, there are certain stages that absolutely everybody goes through. The only variant is how quickly you go through them. So what I'm going to share with you here is quite an accepted kind of model, if you like, that I've adapted for the situation, which you might find helpful, because what it might help us do is identify where we are in that change, identify where we are right now, so and what sort of things tell us where we are right now, to help us move through the process in a productive way. And the reason why we're doing this is because we are 6 months into this process, and now is a really good time to ask ourselves, how are we doing at this? How are we doing at pulling together everything we need to pull together to create the ministry that we are responsible for creating, and how this process actually feels to us in where we are right now. So that's really what this is all about, is just answering those questions, and looking at how we can come to terms with it. Under normal circumstances, we would do a few exercises to kind of bring things to life. Obviously, we can't do that because we're remote, and we're doing this on Zoom rather than a meeting room. But what I will do is I'll describe an exercise that you can certainly take away from this and do yourself, and give you some examples of where it's been used and how it's been really effective in the past. And I think you'd be surprised at some of the momentous changes that have come about in history, using quite a simple model to make it work. So if it works for them, it should work for us. So there's a reason why. I mean, I don't know about you, but at the end of the last meeting, I was sort of pulling my hair out a little bit, and I was thinking, gosh, this has been a tough meeting. We've been trying to run through treacle a little bit here, and there's a very good reason why that is going to happen, because we're being asked to make an almighty change. Because nobody on this group asked for this. Not a single person put their hand up and said, oh, Bishop June, wouldn't it be great if we just merged all these parishes? No one actually asked for this. And on top of that, we all have very strong emotional connections to our own parishes and to the way things have been up until now, which is why we all volunteer to serve, which is why we all volunteer to do our bit, is because it matters to us and we care strongly about it. So if you've got that as a cocktail, you're always going to have resistance. Emotions are sometimes going to overtake logic, and it's going to get in the way from time to time of making progress. And by the sounds of it, we've overcome quite a bit of that in the committee meetings that have met since. But I just wanted to kind of go through this exercise anyway, because there's no downside to being able to identify where some of the barriers are, how we overcome them, and how we move this process more efficiently. So what I've done is I've adapted something. The original thing is called the Change House. But as we are a church, I thought the Change Church was altogether more appropriate. And what this does, this just basically maps out the 4 different stages everyone always goes through when they're having to come to terms with a major change. So this is kind of the only, as I say, the only variant is the pace. So the reason why we're doing this is for you to listen to what some of the symptoms are according to which chamber you're in. And recognize, oh, right, oh, I'm there. That sounds very familiar. That's certainly where I am now, or that's certainly where I remember being recently. And then, by inference, how we get through it. So at the very beginning, before any change comes about, when we're all feeling comfortable, where things are being done the way they've always been done. I've put us in the chancel for that. So that's what the psychologist would describe as a chamber of contentment. All is well with the world, all is comfortable, all is familiar. And then completely out of the blue, without you needing to ask for anything, a big change is suddenly thrust upon you. And that's when you move right the way out, the furthest point from the altar, up into the bell tower. And the bell tower, when an initial change comes around, is a place where it's very easy to deny that the change is happening. Even though it's as clear as a bell, do you see what I did there? We try and pretend it's not happening. And there are certain things that you might hear yourself say or think if that's the chamber you're in. So the first thing is, oh, this probably won't happen. This is just a pie in the sky idea. This is blue sky thinking. This is something that's been said, in Llandaff. I can't ever see it happening. Another thing you might say, well, it might be happening, but it probably won't affect us. We will probably be unscathed. This will probably affect the other parishes more than us. There we go. And I can't see because of the way this screen is working. There we go. And things will probably carry on as they are. And these are all things that you're quite likely to have said, or maybe are still saying, I don't know, about the change that we're having to manage in these meetings. The good news is, once you get beyond that, we have got another chamber to think about, which is also quite a tricky one. So once we've got past the fact that the change is actually going to happen, we're no longer denying it's going to happen, we've accepted it, that it is real. Unfortunately, the next thing we tend to go through is a bit of anger and a bit of confusion. And there was definitely a bit of that on show in the last meeting that we had. So I've moved us out of the bell tower and now put us into the NARTHEX, which I think is quite appropriate because it's a place where you can observe what's going on in a church without actually being accepted into it. So I think that's a very good analogy. Things we might say if we're in this particular stage. Why us? This is so wrong. This is so unfair. How can they do this to us? There is also a door down to the catacombs, which we need to stay away from. But you probably noticed with some of the language, all that language is the language of a victim, that something is being imposed on us, and we are innocent bystanders who are having to suffer. And again, this is perfectly natural. It's a perfectly natural phase for everyone to go through when they're coming to terms with a big change. The catacombs, that's just an implication of the fact that it's quite easy to get stuck in this chamber, and it's for some people it can be easy to move on, but for others they can stay here for months and just reminisce about how great everything was, and feel how they are the victims of something because they are a subject to this change. Half the battle is knowing you're there. Once you know you're there, you're in a position to start looking out for the signs that you're there, and also to look out for the things that will help you move out of there. Because when you do move out of there, you do move into somewhere altogether more positive, which is the nave in this instance. And the nave is a positive place. It's still not a comfortable place, but rather than being defensive or angry, you are starting to look for solutions. And the sort of thing you say when you're in the nave is, for example, okay, so I didn't ask for this change, but how can I make it work for me? Or let's have a look at the potential benefits that could come from this change. Because no matter how terrible something might be on first examination, there is invariably always a positive that comes out of it somewhere. And at the very least, that is going to be a benefit that we'll start to spot. The other thing is, well, how can we use this to our advantage? So once you get into the nave, you are starting to get to grips with what the change is all about. And that's when you start to make progress. And that's when we start to really get some traction. So if you've identified with either of the previous two chambers that I've just mentioned, this is where we're trying to get to, because it's from here that we can finish the process. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I don't know, is anybody on the call familiar with this man, a man by the name of Jason Anker?
No.
No? Okay. Jason Anker is a writer and a motivational speaker and lots of other things. When he was in his 20s, he was a labourer. He was working on a roof. And there was an accident. He fell off the roof and he ended up being paralysed from the chest down. And having to cope with the life-changing consequences of this really pulled him to pieces. He all he could dwell on was the fact that he would never ever be able to kick a ball around the garden with his son, that he'd never be able to walk his daughter down the aisle. As with quite often with men, when they're down, their friends to cheer them up, take them to the pub, get them drunk to try and bring them out of themselves. And then of course he got awarded a huge sum of money as compensation, and that led to alcoholism. And it really, he really dived to a very deep low. But he identified the day when his life turned around, when he had this thought, and the thought was, an able-bodied person, a fully able-bodied person, there might be 3,000 things that they can do. And all he'd been concentrating on, the only things he'd been thinking about, were the 1,000 things he couldn't do anymore now he was in a wheelchair. What he wasn't thinking about was the 2,000 things he was still perfectly able to do. And that was a light bulb moment for him. And there are similar things for us in all of this, in how we move forward. So I just thought I'd share that with you, because I think that brings very much to life what I'm talking about in the transition between those two chambers, between chambers 2 and 3. And this is a little exercise that you might want to do to help you out. I'm going to make sure that these slides are circulated, so you don't have to memorize what I put on here word for word. You can come back to it and do it in your own time. Part of the reason why I think it's good for you to do it yourselves is because some of the resistance you might be feeling to this change might be very personal. You might not feel comfortable discussing it with us. So the exercise is basically to write down a list. If you've got Post-its, that's even better, but write down a list of everything that you personally feel is a barrier or a problem, or something that's, some kind of emotional conflict that you have with what we're doing. And then draw yourself 2 circles. And in each circle, you write on one side, these are the things that I can influence. And on the other one, these are the things that I cannot influence. And put the stickers in each circle, because it'll really help you focus on where you need to spend your time. So here's a couple of examples, okay? So we're thinking, okay, so the day-to-day running of our ministry, is that going to be something that we can influence? What's your view on that?
Yes.
Yeah, that is definitely something we're going to be able to influence. How we manage our finance, is that something we can influence?
Yes.
Yeah, it definitely is. How we share ideas to get better at fundraising, is that something that we can influence?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely it is. How we engage with younger worshippers. I don't know if you look around your church and I look around mine, I see people and I think, what's this church going to look like in 20 years time? Is that something that we can influence?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's vast. That's a massive issue. Decide who does what roles in the new ministry. Is that something we can influence?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Decide whether this merger goes ahead or not.
No.
No. That is something we can't influence. And no matter how much that might grate, and no matter how big a deal it is for you, in the same way as Mr. Anker, not being able to walk anymore is a huge issue, it's not something we can influence. So it's something that doesn't deserve airtime. It's something that we can discuss amongst ourselves. But in these meetings, because we can't influence it, it really isn't something that we need to talk about. And let me show you an example of that in play. And this is genuine from history. This, if you don't recognize the people in that picture, I'm sure everyone will recognize Nelson Mandela on the right-hand side. Do people remember his predecessor?
Yeah.
Mr. de Klerk, correct, Mr. de Klerk. So when these two parties before these two parties, you know, were both recognised as legitimate political forces, there was an almighty impasse when it came to having talks. Both sides said they were prepared to talk, but de Klerk's government were not prepared to talk to the ANC unless they denounced all violence and disarmed. The ANC said, well, we're not going to disarm, we're not going to renounce violence until you dismantle apartheid. And that was how it went for a long, long time. You had this huge barrier in the middle. There was no shifting on either side. And then one day, somebody had the bright idea of saying, right, okay, let's just stop for a minute. We can't agree on dismantling apartheid or disarming, but can we agree that schools are important? Can we agree that seeing South Africans getting a good education is something that we are agreed upon? And all sides said, well, yes, of course, that is something we agreed upon. So that is something that immediately moved into things we can influence. And they started talking about schools. And once they started talking about schools, they started talking about public health. They started talking about infrastructure. And they started talking about all the things that they could influence outside of the big issues that just seemed totally insurpassable. And in the end, they were talking about so many different things that these massive barriers that had so long seemed totally impassable suddenly became something that they could discuss. And it's just this process that allowed it to happen. So if it can work for them, I'm pretty confident it can work for us. But it's something I suggest you have a go at. Once we get through all of this, once we get past the KNAVE questioning how we adapt and how we make this work and what the solutions are, the great news is we end up back in the chancel. And when we're in the chancel, we find ourselves saying things like, why did that change seem to be so difficult? This really isn't so bad. I can't believe we built it up to be such an issue. And genuinely, that is a point that we will all get to. But I just thought, you know, it may seem like mumbo jumbo, but I think possibly quite a few of us on the call might find that helpful, just to say, yeah, that's right. These are some of the thoughts I'm having. So that's what I need to get to. So that's the exercise I can do. And I'm kind of hoping that we have found that helpful. It's a little bit off the chart in terms of the sort of things we normally talk about. But I just want to thank you all for taking part and giving me the opportunity to share that.